Hello, I'm Edward Lucas. Welcome to Intelligence Squared Plus. I'm delighted to introduce our guest today, Mikhail Zygar. He's a writer, journalist, filmmaker. He worked for Newsweek Russia and Kommersant, the business daily. He's a foreign correspondent covering conflicts in the Middle East, Iraq, Serbia, and Kosovo. And he was also the founding editor-in-chief of Russia's, at the time, only independent news channel, Dozhd, which was a big alternative to the Kremlin propaganda machine, and now, of course, is in exile. Mikhail won the International Press Freedom Award in 2014. He's the author of several books, including All the Kremlin's Men, which was a #1 bestseller in Russia, available in English. And his new book is War and Punishment, Putin, Zelensky, and the Path to Russia's Invasion of Ukraine. Mikhail, thanks so much for joining us.
That's a huge honor for me. Thank you.
But the thing that really caught my attention at the beginning is it's a kind of, not exactly a love letter, but a sort of apology letter to your friend Nadia in Kiev. And you used to go and stay with Nadia whenever you were there. And you say very sadly that she doesn't talk to you anymore because she thinks you're an imperialist. And in a way, your book is a kind of attack on Russian imperialism. And I suppose it, in a way, also sort of an apology to Nadia. Has she read the book?
I don't know. The book has just been released in English, and I'm not sure if it's going to be released in Russian or in Ukrainian within the upcoming months, at least. So I have no idea if she has heard about this book, but I hope that she will, and I hope that many Ukrainians will read this book as well. I don't mean that this book is written for the Ukrainians, because Ukrainians have a lot of brilliant authors who have written a lot of very uh, important books on Ukrainian history. This book is not Ukrainian history. That's a history of Russia and Russian imperialism. That this approach to the Russian history would be very important for Ukrainian audience as well as for the Russians.
Yes, it's interesting. I have many Ukrainian friends who just say they're profoundly uninterested in anything the Russians have to say right now. There's a kind of feeling that it's time for the Russians just to shut up, whether they're Kremlin Russians or what they call liberal imperialist Russians. It's all pretty much the same thing, and we'll get onto that in a bit later on in the discussion. But I want to really kick off by introducing your book to the audience, and you break it into two parts. There's 7 tales of colonial oppression in Ukraine, starting with the sort of appropriation of Kievan Rus by Russia, and ending up with the appropriation of the World War II story from a Russian imperialist point of view. And then you follow that up with 7 tales of present day oppression in Ukraine, starting with the way in which Ukraine struggled against Soviet rule in that era, and ending up with what you call how Volodymyr Zelensky stopped joking. So tell me, why did you decide to do it this way? This sort of first the distant past and then the more recent past.
Mm, First, I think that the distant past, is very important because unfortunately, history is very much alive, and historical mythology is being always used to explain the current political situation, to justify the war. Unfortunately, Russia doesn't have any proper history, although it has always had a bunch of historical myths or propagandist myths, which were used for the benefit of the power. Um, so I, right after the war started, I felt some kind of moral obligation to try to destroy traditional imperialist historical narrative of Russia, and I think that it was such a shock to convince a lot of people that we need de-imperialize our history and we need to start writing it from the scratch, because most of traditional Russian historians were imperialistic propagandists. So yes, this book is probably my first step in the long way to try to debunk the imperial myths. I've got seven most important myths about uh, Russia and Ukraine. That I don't think that my work is done with this book.
Indeed. Well, you start off your introduction by saying that the uh, it's a kind of it starts off by saying it's a confession, and you say that Russian writers and historians are complicit in facilitating this war, and it's their words and thoughts over the past 350 years that sowed the seeds of Russian fascism and allowed it to flourish. You say we failed to spot how deadly the idea of Russia as a great empire was, and we overlooked the fact that for many centuries the quote great Russian culture belittled other countries and peoples and suppressed and destroyed them. And then you go on to these seven myths which have proved so deadly today. Now we don't have time to go through every bit of the of the first seven or the second seven, so we'll have to pick out a few. And I want to say to people who are watching and listening online that we'll be talking for about another half hour, and for the final 20 minutes of this, you'll have a chance to put your questions. So if you feel I've missed something out, you can jump in and highlight that, and I'll be particularly happy to have thoughts from any Ukrainians who are listening. But I suppose that it all starts off with this idea that Kievan Rus is somehow something to do with modern Russia, and that is something that Putin believes absolutely profoundly, that Ukrainians have appropriated something that's profoundly Russian. Whereas, of course, from a Ukrainian point of view, it's exactly the other way around, that Rus has nothing to do with Russia, and that the true heir of the ancient Rus is modern Ukraine. So, for those who haven't followed these important events of 350 years ago so closely, just talk us through the first of your myths, the myth of unity.
Yeah, actually, I don't start with Kiev and Rus. I start with much more recent, much closer past, with so-called mythical reunification, so-called reunification of Russia and Ukraine, infamous treaty between the Tsardom of Moscow and Cossack Hetmanate. The contract signed between Tsar Alexis and Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And it's really important that it was perceived in a very different way by different parts. For Cossacks, it was just a contract signed between two equal parts, but Tsar of Moscow did not get that idea of the contract, how he could sign any contract with anyone. So for him, that was just a pledge, and that was the beginning of all the miscomprehensions between the Russian authoritarian power and Ukrainians.
Yes, but and I think the point is that to have the myth of reunification, you have to have the myth of unity at the beginning, and you go through this in. You then follow it up with the story of Ivan Mazepa and his row with Peter the Great, and then Catherine the Great's tussles with the Cossacks, from which we see how conflictual this relationship was. And of course, from the Russian point of view, they see the Ukrainians as sort of disobedient little brothers who go off and do things like making alliances with the Swedes that ends in disaster. Whereas from a Ukrainian point of view, it's really quite different. But let's get on to the question of language, because this is something that is at the heart of the war now and of Russia's imperialist attitude to Ukraine. And but it has very deep roots. For those viewers to this discussion who aren't familiar with it, talk us through the story of Taras Shevchenko and how he battled slavery, which you call the myth of language.
That's very important, important and symbolic figure for Ukrainian history. That that proves that Ukrainian language was not, as Russian imperialists usually say, a deviation of Russian or some wrong Russian language. And Ukrainians were speaking Ukrainian language for centuries, and that's probably an important difference between, let's say, Austrian Empire and Russian Empire. They had very different perception of ethnic minorities. For example, Ukrainians who lived in Austrian Empire, they were from the start considered to be second-class citizens, and they could not reach the higher classes. They didn't have opportunity to become the part of the political elite. But at the same time, there was no discrimination in which they could Ukrainian language. At the same time, in Russia, everything was very much different. Ukrainians could become part of privileged Russian society with only one condition: if they abandoned their Ukrainian background and if they spoke only Russian. And there are a lot of examples of ministers, chancellors of Ukrainian background who stopped speaking Ukrainian, who started Russian, and so it was that's very important because Russian Empire was being built as a political nation. Anyone could have become Russian, abandoning his or her own culture and started speaking Russian. So that's why probably the Russian language and Russian culture bears additional responsibility for the crimes of the Russian Empire.
Yes, it's interesting how language has become a political category. There's this phrase in Russian of Russian speakers, and we saw this already in the very early 90s with a man called Sergei Karaganov came up with something called the Karaganov Doctrine, which elevated the Russian speakers to a political category and said that the Kremlin had the right and indeed the duty to intervene in other countries on behalf of Russian speakers. And there were people at the time who thought that this was as sinister as creating German speaker as a political category. And we know how that ended in Europe in the 30s. But people were very unwilling then in that era to accept that this sort of linguistic ethno-nationalism, if one can call it that, was sinister. But of course, it comes back now very, very clearly in Putin's distaste and the Putin propaganda machine's sort of idea that the Ukrainian language is something that is so sinister it has to be eradicated, and it's sort of quite extraordinary sort of exterminationist rhetoric. Which comes up. I was wondering, when you were in Ukraine for much report, you did a lot of reporting there, and you've interviewed many of the leading figures of Ukrainian political and public life in the last 30 years. Did you learn any Ukrainian yourself?
I understand Ukrainian perfectly because every time participating in a political talk show in Ukraine, and Ukrainian television has always been very politicized, and the focus on political talk shows was enormous. And average political talk show lasted for 4 hours. And it has always been a mixture of languages. Several guests used to speak Russian, sometimes even the presenters, but majority was speaking Ukrainian, and it was okay for everyone talking in two different languages at the same time. So it was a very long school for me, and every now and then coming to Kiev, I always was going to Ukrainian theaters and cinema theaters, watching a lot in Ukrainian. So for me, it's very easy to read Ukrainian books and to listen to Ukrainians. So I'm not an active speaker, but I think that I know Ukrainian language very well, and I know all the differences. I can read Shevchenko in his original.
Yes, it's very interesting you say that because when I lived in the Soviet Union, I was very struck by the kind of profound asymmetry that everyone in the Soviet Union spoke Russian, but almost no Russians spoke anything other than Russian. So you always had to, and it had echoes to me of and perhaps the British presence in India, where if you
Yeah,
wanted to get on,
that's the same as with British Empire, and yeah,
yes,
many people speak English, do not feel obliged to speak other languages, unfortunately.
yes. We're going to fast forward a bit to the you touch on one of the other myths, which is which Putin has said quite recently, that Ukraine is just a creation of Lenin and the result of the territorial division of the Tsarist Empire following the Bolshevik Revolution. And we could have a whole an hour's discussion on that, and with all the interesting literary and historical aspects, such as Bulgakov's great novel, The White Guard. But I think we can't do do justice to anything involving
I
Russia
think
Ukraine.
that's just pathetic. That
Yeah,
idea that Lenin invented Ukraine is
it
just
is. Yes,
ridiculous.
but
Yeah.
I think we have to spend a few minutes on the hunger the hunger genocide, the Holodomor, which is probably the defining event of the century of the past century for Ukraine, and is even more traumatic and catastrophic than the events following 1917. And become now a very important part of Ukrainian historiography, but not so much of Russian, and of course then followed on by the Stalin Great Terror. What would you say? What's the myth about the Holodomor in Russia that you're trying to attack?
Mm, you know, it's very interesting that Russian historians, as well as Russian journalists, um, usually justify some crimes uh, by telling that that was normal. That was normal situation. It happened to everyone, as if now they are comparing the aggression against Ukraine, Russian aggression against Ukraine, to the um, American war in Iraq. Say that, okay, they did it. Why cannot we do the same? They use terrible crimes of others to justify their own crimes, or when speaking about Holodomor, the usual explanation is there was a huge famine everywhere. There was, yes, okay, there was a famine in Ukraine, but also in Volga region, and also in Kazakhstan. So there was nothing extraordinary about that. Yeah, everyone was dying, and that's a huge mistake. That's um, famine in Kazakhstan does not explain and does not justify the great crime of Stalin's regime in Ukraine. And Holodomor in Ukraine obviously was organized and pre-orchestrated by Stalin because of his hatred towards Ukrainians, because he didn't trust Ukrainians. Not only about the Great Famine, it was also the huge attack against Ukrainian culture. And no Russian usually is aware of such a tragedy of Ukrainian nation as um, executed Renaissance. The greatest poets, writers, philosophers of Ukrainian nation were arrested, executed, sent to Gulag, and that happened at the same time when most Ukrainian villagers were dying out of hunger. So that was not just a part of the full picture. That was an organized campaign against Ukraine, and
Right.
it's really needed to understand that for many Russians, as well as for the international audience.
Yes. Um, I want to just touch briefly now on the question of Stepan Bandera, because it's interesting how this brings together two of the great sort of Russian sort of Putin era propaganda tropes. One is the absolute centrality of the cult of victory in 1945, that Russia is the inheritor of Soviet heroism and the glory of the defeat of the Third Reich, and that anyone who disputes this is therefore ipso facto a Nazi. And then the second great thing is that the Ukrainians are ungrateful and rebellious, and Bandera, who was at least a part of the war a Nazi collaborator, though also later on a Nazi, a prisoner of the Nazis, the leader of the Ukrainian nationalist insurrection, is a lightning rod for both of those. But it's still something that troubles many outsiders when they look at Ukraine. They say, yes, we support Ukraine in their struggle against Russians, but why torchlight processions for Bandera, who is tarred with anti-Semitism and with many other, and also the massacre of Poles in Volhynia. So for many Russians who basically support Ukraine, Bandera is a very serious sticking point. Explain what's your treatment of Bandera, both in terms of his wartime activities and his role in Ukraine now.
I think that history should not be very simplistic. It has always been very complicated, and all those details are important. If someone calls Bandera to be a Nazi collaborator, he's not more Nazi collaborator than Stalin, because actually any cooperation with the Nazi regime, right, accidentally, but right after German invasion of the Soviet Union, because he and his supporters of Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists proclaimed independent Ukraine, and that was something Hitler did not anticipate and didn't want. So Bandera was sent to the concentration camp and spent most of the World War II in the concentration camp. And Bandera's idea and Bandera's only goal was to establish independent Ukraine, and he was very principled in those terms. Okay, and if we to explain that to a broader audience, we might remember that leader of Indian independence movement during World War II were also supportive of Hitler, not because they were Nazis, but because they were against British Empire. So yes, Bandera was against Soviet Empire, and that was the top priority for him. And yes,
Right.
for Ukraine today, Bandera is at the same time very symbolic, at the same time very divisive figure. But I think the current war has made a lot to accept that figure, because now we have Putin as the real fascist, as the real Nazi, and we have seen the real evil Russian aggression against Ukraine, and that makes most of the decisions made by Stepan Bandera very
Right.
much understandable.
Yeah. I want to whiz on to the man you describe as the most popular politician in the world, Volodymyr Zelensky, and you chart his rise first in the world of television showbiz and then into politics. But you draw a very interesting point, which I want to bring out, which is that the roots of his approach to television lie in a Soviet era program, which is really quite hard to describe. It was the club of the sort of the cheerful and go-getters, and it's very hard to explain to an English-speaking audience. It was the most popular program in the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
I watched it many times.
yeah,
So,
that's a championship for stand-up comedians. Yeah,
a championship for
teams for
comedians.
stand-up comedians. Yeah.
So talk us through this, because the sort of Russian-Ukrainian culture and memory wars were played out sometimes in skits where different teams from different parts of the Soviet Union would sort of compete to satirize the news, and then it was and it's that program really which was a sort of the roots of Zelensky's own comedy programs, which made him rich and famous in Ukraine even before he became president.
Yeah, for me it was very important to tell that story and to show how the humor was changing, because it shows very clearly the trajectory and the trend, how the mentality of Ukrainian society and Russian society was changing after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that the jokes that seem appropriate in early 90s have become terribly insulting during the last decade, and the two societies of two different countries have changed a lot. But it's also very important that Vladimir Zelensky himself was changing, and he started as a just pure stand-up comedian, and his sense of humor has become very politicized. And it has become a very important factor. For example, in 2014, when he made a sketch about Vladimir Putin and his supposedly mistress Alina Kabaeva, and Zelensky himself was playing the role of Alina Kabaeva, and that was probably the first moment when Vladimir Putin heard of Zelensky, and so the first thing he knew about the new president of Ukraine, or that time definitely presidential candidate. He knew that that's the guy who played Alina Kabaeva. So that was a huge insult for Vladimir Putin from the beginning, something that he could never tolerate and forgive.
You also bring out the very strong streak of what one might call anti-Ukrainian racism in both the Soviet and Russian discourse. I was very struck by the fact you dug out something which I remember from 1991, I think it was, which was the final New Year's um, program of the last year of the Soviet Union, when they didn't quite know who was going to conduct give the sort of the New Year's toast, because Yeltsin was politely indisposed in one direction and Gorbachev was already out, and a comedian who I think was called Zadornov just had a sort of string of really unpleasant anti-Ukrainian jokes. And this is something that has been a hallmark of Russian discourse since then. The idea that Ukrainians are sort of hicks or rednecks or sort of basically stupid. And I've always been very struck by how few Russians were willing to call that out. It seemed to be sort of the only acceptable Russians who would be ashamed to make jokes about Jews or black people were quite happy to make jokes about Ukrainians.
I think that we've come a long way, and that I somehow in early 90s and even in during the late years of the Soviet Union, there was an idea that Russians are the people who are suffering the most. They bear all the responsibility and they pay all the costs of living in the Soviet Union, and they kind of pay for everyone. They work for everyone, they supply everyone, they feed everyone, and they are very offended for because all other nationalities want to leave Soviet Union. So that idea that Russian people were betrayed by Lithuanians, Georgians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, and so on was very popular, and that was something a lot of people felt in early 90s and later on after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's really strange. It's really weird. That's the product of the post-Soviet propaganda, and that's the source of that weird mindset shared by Vladimir Putin as well as many Russians.